Welcome to another informal discussion on building a more inclusive digital and analog world, where we'll learn about what's on the minds of experienced practitioners in the tech for social impact space. Today I'm speaking with Lindsey Cochran. Lindsey is a UX researcher and service designer. She's a former social worker with a master's in social welfare, which she uses to inform her work in the tech industry. So Lindsey, let's just jump right into things. What's one big thing on your mind right now that you think that we need to be paying more attention to?
I think that we as well, so I'm a designer, a service designer and researcher. So we create products and services, but I don't think we necessarily, one, think about if these products and services are inclusive, and we don't think if what we're making is equitable. And I also don't think we really evaluate impact.
Hmm.
So those were kind of the three main reasons as a social worker I wanted to get into that field, because I felt like there wasn't a diverse perspective necessarily, and including different voices at the table. And I felt like as a social worker, I was really trained to listen and to advocate and bring those voices to the table. And so that's how I got into design. And what I did is, after kind of learning the ropes after a year, I made a model or framework that could help promote equity. And so with the model, I basically kind of started out with an idea of how, if it's before a project, if it's during a project, if it's evaluating a product, or if it's evaluating a service, or if it's even creating a like scoping research, there's a few steps that you can do to make sure that it's more equitable and inclusive and thoughtful. And so if you want, I can just kind of briefly, I can
Yeah,
either
if you
share
could
my screen
talk
and
us through at a high level, like what does that look like?
yeah. So here, I'll share my screen. Is that okay? Does that,
Oh yeah, go for it.
yeah. All right, never mind. I can't share right now. So
Oh, that's okay.
kind of the first part of the model is self-education. So kind of doing this work on your own time, and perhaps like before you start a project, is understanding kind of historical context, understanding, economic inequity, bias, power structures, systemic racism, intersectional feminism, just to kind of name a few.
Mm.
Um, and, I think it's really important to just kind of also think about philosophy and, just read. And so some people that I like to read are Elizabeth Anderson or Bell Hooks, to gain a little bit of knowledge, Noam Chomsky as well.
Mhm.
And then the second step is develop a set of ethics. So with you or with your team, share those learnings and kind of create some values that you want to include in your work. For example, not using the hook model for your project. If you're if
Which
you're against creating negative behaviors, I don't know if everyone knows what the hook model is, but
I don't know if everyone watching will, so it might
right.
help for you to share that a bit.
So so essentially, like, the hook model is based off of kind of your dopamine, and it each
Mm.
step you take when interacting with a product really kind of hits your reward system.
Yeah.
So, for instance, Facebook, you have a post and then everybody likes and comments, like that kind of gets you hooked into that algorithm, and it can get really kind of complex and nasty. And
Mm.
so, you and your teammates might say, hey, I don't want to do that. I don't want
Yeah.
to participate in using kind of those, I forget what it's called, dark something.
Okay.
Um, And so, yes, develop a set of ethics. And then, when it comes to, again, if you're creating a service, product, or, a research scope, think about the needs and barriers that of people that you are creating a service or product for. So consider how your outputs could affect different population needs,
Mm.
create barriers for them. You could ask questions like, does this output address the needs of low income populations? Do we even know what the needs of low income populations are? Are we thinking
Yeah.
about that when we're creating something?
Yeah.
Um, and then, uh, and some examples of like people to think about are like underserved societal needs, mass market needs, differently abled populations, marginalized populations, and then of course, the user that you're trying to target.
Yeah. And do you
And
find, and apologies, there's more steps, and we'll get to the other
yeah,
steps,
yeah,
but I just
sure,
want
sure.
to ask here, how do you find the reception in terms of people that you work with in introducing some of this? Because I think there are some people who would say, even if they want to be behave ethically in their in whatever technology platform they might be deploying, or that I've often seen that become secondary when
Hmm.
other pressures come to bear. So
Hmm.
if that's in the for-profit, obviously there's profit
Yeah.
pressures. In the nonprofit sector, it often can be specific donor pressures that
Mhm.
are pushing them in a direction which might force them to not necessarily ignore some of those ethical aspects, but again just put them at a secondary level when they have these other impact indicators that they're looking at, whether that be profit or otherwise.
100%. I would say that's the biggest barrier for creating kind of ethical work and work that where you're kind of measuring impact for it is that it's not a priority. In at the end of the day, I'm a consultant, so our projects run really lean. We have really tight deadlines, and we're beholden to
Mm,
the client.
yeah.
So you can't necessarily say like, "Hey, um, big huge corporation, like, are we making sure this thing that you paid us a bunch of money to make is going to be inclusive?" So, kind of a tip that I have is if if you think about these things enough and you try to really ingrain it within your work, it can become reflexive. And
Mm,
then two, you don't even really need to like talk to the client about it that much. You can
yeah.
just make this a part of your work. You can just kind of try to scope out a little bit of time to make sure you are just taking that extra step to thinking about who's included, what voices are at the table, how is this going to impact people, and just ask a few of those questions. I mean, it's hard, and I will be totally transparent and say, when I made this model and I kind of wrote this article, everybody at my work was so excited, they loved it. And then, you know, when, you just don't have time to really think about these things. And
Yeah.
so I'm what I've done now kind of in this current climate, have brought this back to the table a bit and
Mm,
started saying like, okay, can we now make this a priority? Because that's really what it is. It's what you value.
yeah.
So are we as a company or as a society going to put, people over profit or profit over people? And we need to start having those hard conversations and make people actually say it.
Yeah.
Make our leadership say it. Make leadership say, we're going to choose profit. And, inclusivity is important, but it's not as important as running a tight, making sure we meet our deadlines.
Yeah. Or even better, perhaps saying, we're going to recognize the value
Yeah.
of both, and we're going to actually,
For that
yeah.
one.
And there certainly are companies in the U.S. And globally,
Yeah.
that are pursuing more of a social enterprise type
Hmm.
model, or benefit corporation model, other models where they're ingraining that the social factor, the
Hmm.
environmental factor, alongside with the profit
Hmm.
factor. So were there other steps because I stopped
Yeah.
you with the question?
So
I want to let
yeah.
you continue.
And again, like this isn't like brain science, this isn't, just revelatory, but I think sometimes it's just helpful to have, and I find this too when I studied psychology, that they, when, you would talk about bias or things like that, it was so obvious, but I guess not having it written down makes it easier kind of to follow. And so
Mhm.
next is, so you kind of think of the needs and barriers, and then consider the consequences. So what are the intentional or unintentional consequences of your work? um, is this language inclusive? Will it leave populations out? Is this
Yeah.
output going to negatively influence behavior? What I think is really interesting and always like an ethical quandary I have is, I don't know if you know anything about behavioral economics.
A little bit.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of, for instance, like an example of behavioral economics is like, to help influence behavior, towards towards a user or a person making a certain decision. So like in the Netherlands, they wanted people to throw away their trash more, so they painted little footprints on a path to a trash can. And so they found that painting those footprints would, people were more likely to throw things away.
Yeah.
And so that's behavioral economics. And so while it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. And so again, you kind of have to think with your set of values and ethics, do we want to use these practices? How do we want to use them? Are we going to like limit ourselves to certain things? And so consider the consequences. And then lastly, reflect on, and this part is kind of, I think, the hardest thing to do if you're a consultant. If you're in-house, I think it's a little bit easier, but think of how the work's impact has materialized and think of ways you could change your outputs and, what were the impacts financially or behaviorally on certain populations? What did you learn? What can you change?
Yeah.
And again, like, I think I was trained as a social worker, so I take this very specific lens to everything I work on. And so all of these questions really become internal. Like I don't even realize I'm doing it all the time.
Yeah.
And so I think the more that you practice and the more that you read and the more that you are talking to your coworkers or other people on your team about these things, the more normalized it will become.
Yeah. And I would imagine, I mean, particularly if people are in-house, it could potentially even be more impactful because it can become an iterative
Yes.
process where they're continuing. It's not like if you're a consultant and you hand off the work and you did all of this, but then however it gets taken and evolves after you're gone, you're not part of that conversation. If it's
Right.
not been sort of internalized in the minds of those people who are moving it forward, then you can lose
Yeah.
some of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so how, do you have thoughts on, I know you said, you don't necessarily have to put it front and center in terms of communicating this to the client or even internally.
Hmm.
Um, but do you have ideas on how to really get some of this messaging to stick? Get some of these ideas to stick so that they do live beyond just that initial design stage and continue into the iterative
Hmm.
deployment.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think in design and social work and research or whatever, you have to make sure that things you're doing are actionable. And I think that can be the hardest part is kind of making something stick. And it's really easy to get excited and to, use it or think or to have these discussions on a few projects, but then kind of get sidetracked. I don't know if this fully answers your question, but I just started a work group kind of around this with some of my employees, and it's kind of under the umbrella of inclusive design. And so, and everyone kind of has a different definition or lens they bring to inclusive design. So,
Yeah.
for instance, one person within the work group is really, is an expert, knows a lot about, designing things for a differently abled population.
Mm.
My focus for inclusive design, I think, is going to bring more of like a systemic, because, just because I was a social worker on a more macro level and I was working within systems a lot, I think
Yeah.
I bring that systems thinking lens kind of more into, a systemic racism and sexism and those types of things to our work. And so I
Mm.
think having a work group or having a designated group of people who also want to keep these things alive is really helpful, and getting organized. So
Mm.
again, using my social work background, we know how to get people organized.
Yeah.
There are things like making a project charter, and it can be a project charter about inclusivity, like having roles for people. Who's going to be the champion? Who's going to work with leadership? Who's going to be the person to, make a list of action items? And so I
Mm.
think getting organized and almost kind of setting up a grassroots effort internally with your company to make
Yeah.
sure that these messages are, going to be iterated upon or continue after you leave or after the project's over.
Yeah. Great. Um, and we kind of already started touching on this. One of the things that we always like to leave these conversations with is talking about one or two actionable things that people can actually take away from this and
Mhm.
start doing immediately.
Mhm.
So you've given us a couple of ideas, but if I'm thinking about somebody who is working in an organization, maybe this is not um, this is not their primary role. They're not a designer, but they're involved in the design process.
Mhm.
Do you have suggestions of additional things beyond what you shared so far that they could do right away, to sort of instill some of these ideas, and that could be pointing them to resources or just ideas that you have, and we can add resources in the description as well if you have links that you want to share. But
Mhm.
just curious, what sort of actionable advice would you give to
Yeah.
people?
I think find an ally. I think if you can find an ally that has, within leaders, has a leadership position within your organization, is really helpful to kind of get behind um, some of these, thoughts. That's really helpful. But I think it really starts with self education and self education that's outside of the tech industry. So
Mm,
start by reading literature that isn't like me writing a Medium article,
yeah,
but somebody like Bell Hooks, who's going to really bring that perspective and teach you about intersectional feminism or institutionalized racism. Like, really begin to, I think, educate yourself on how these inequities play out. And then you can start applying that and thinking about how that can manifest in the work that you're doing, or even within your internal company dynamics. It doesn't even
yeah,
have to be about, the thing that you're making. It could just be about a group that you're working in, and you can see these things play out. And these are really, really tough conversations to have. They are. And it takes a
yeah,
lot of work and skill. And it's not easy. And like I said, again, I was like trained for 2 years on how to like have these really tough conversations. And when I first started my grad program, even though I was a social worker for so long, I still was pretty clueless. I came to the table pretty uneducated about this stuff. So I
yeah,
really think um, just kind of outside of the tech space, thinking about it, and then seeing how you can kind of bridge that gap together and see where these things overlap. And I can give you a list of books or articles I've read. And again, I think this is so topical because of everything that's going on right now. People are really hungry and curious, and they want resources and they want to learn, and they see that these things are an issue and they're seeing how it manifests. So I think there's a lot of interest in this way. And so it's kind of a
yeah.
perfect time to push these agendas forward.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that is, one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you, and sort of explore this out further. We keep these short and quick, so I'm going to stop us there. But I want to thank you, Lindsay, for sharing all this with us
Yeah.
today. To anyone who's watching, please make sure to share any thoughts or reactions you have in the comments. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. That way you can receive updates on future episodes. So, Lindsay, thanks again, and thank you to everyone watching us today.
Thanks.